Antarctica, Operation High Jump sent packing in 1947. This is the fifth installment of our series about the curious events that led to the military colonization of our most southern continent, Antarctica. In the previous episode of A Bee in Eden, we talked about a crazy story of a secret rescue operation carried out by a British special ops team between October and December of 1945 in Antarctica. To this day, an alleged survivor of this operation has insisted that British intelligence had uncovered a fully functioning Nazi military base operating within the ice-covered caverns on the northern edge of this land. We heard the tale of how this team also came face-to-face with something like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch creature who was used in some kind of security role by the Nazi officials. Today we will dive into the next invasion of Antarctica, but this one was comprised of a fully loaded American team of 4,700 men and 13 ships sent under the oversight of the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, and again organized by that famous polar explorer, Admiral Richard Byrd. This invasion was sent under the guise of being a peacetime scientific mission and came to be known as Operation High Jump. This operation was scheduled to work for 6 months. However, after only 6 weeks, the operation encountered deadly resistance and was sent home with its tail between its legs. What could have possibly happened to cause the United States to abandon such a huge investment of time, money, and manpower in the largest Antarctic mission organized to date? We'll come right back after the break as we dive into yet another cover-up of the newly born post-war deep state. Now, as we mentioned right before the break, our previous episode of this Antarctica saga told the tale of a secret British rescue operation that was launched in October 1945 that came to be known as Operation Tabarin. Now, there's public information about that operation, but then there's also other testimony given by a man who alleged to be a survivor and a participant of that operation. He told the almost too incredible tale of Nazi subterranean bases and hairy polar men. Well, to this day, there's very little information on the Internet that either corroborates or debunks that story. Now, historical events that occurred only a handful of months after this British Operation Tabarin point to a dogged interest being taken by America's Department of Defense in whatever was going on down there near the South Pole. So we must ask ourselves this important question. As the entire planet, her financial systems, and her armies lay in ruins during the smoldering aftermath of World War II, why did the U.S. Navy feel this sudden burning itch to get down to Antarctica as soon as possible in the year 1946? What I mean is, we were all told that Hitler's Nazi party had been defeated. The Russians were just beginning to rebuild their defenses, and even then it would be decades before their Navy would be able to technically challenge the maritime authority of the United States. The Cold War wouldn't really be taking off for another 2 years, so in theory, there should be nobody still active on planet Earth who could challenge the military might of the one superpower left standing, which was the United States of America. And yet, Rear Admiral Byrd and Rear Admiral Cruzen were commissioned by the U.S. Navy to lead an extensive show of military force at the southern continent during Antarctica's most inauspicious time of year, the onset of the Southern Hemisphere's fall and deadly winter seasons. What was so urgent at the South Pole that it couldn't wait at least for warmer weather? Now, in my blog, you'll see that this is the point where I have posted a couple of YouTube links to some important documentaries. One of them is a Russian-produced documentary entitled Operation UFO, Antarctic Nazi Base, or it's also known by the title Operation UFO, the Third Reich Base in Antarctica. The film contains English subtitles, and the subtitles are adequate to tell the story. However, I will caution you that there are some misspellings over names of people and names of the ships. Now, the second YouTube link I have is to an official Hollywood film entitled The Secret Land, and this was produced under the supervision of the U.S. Navy. This movie came out as a regular Hollywood production out in the month October of the year 1948. So that was 18 months after the Americans were possibly sent with their tails between their legs back home to warmer, safer ports. You might even still be able to find copies of this video, as it may have been re-released during the years in some of the video stores. Now, this sanitized naval Hollywood fluff piece makes no mention of a battle that was fought on February 26, 1947, against UFO-looking craft that emerged from supposed Nazi base the base was named 211, or the number 211. And you are free to debunk both the existence and or the testimony of a man who calls himself Lieutenant John Sayerson, which I will quote in just a minute. I have seen internet forums that attempt to debunk that testimony. However, I have not yet seen anything thorough and convincing. Now, near the 10-minute mark of the Russian film, Lieutenant Sayerson's report is inserted into the film. And there is a webpage link at a site called factsarefacts.com, and they report his words as transcribed from the movie. Lieutenant Sayerson reports, the things, or these UFO-looking craft, popped out of the water like they were being chased by the devil and flew at such high speeds between the masts that the antenna between the wind eddy ripped. Some airplanes that were able to get into the air off the Casablanca, that was the name of a ship, were hit moments later by unfamiliar blasts that came from the flying saucers and crashed next to the ships. I was on deck the Casablanca at the time and was totally taken aback. These things did not make a single sound as they flew between our ships and spit deadly fire. Suddenly, the torpedo boat destroyer Maddox, the name of this ship is either misspelled or its record has been erased, which I will get into. Anyway, this destroyer named Maddox, which was about 10 cable lengths or about 2 miles away from us, went up in flames and began to sink. Rescue boats from other ships were sent despite the danger. And here he concludes, the nightmare lasted about 20 minutes. When the flying saucers dove again under the water, we began to count our losses. They were appalling. Now, supposedly, Operation High Jump then aborted its mission and her crew headed home. Rear Admiral Byrd gave an interview to Chile's El Mercurio newspaper only 1 week after this supposed battle. His shocking statements must have made Secretary Forrestal cringe back under his desk in Washington, D.C. Now, let's take another little break here, and when we come back, I'm going to read to you what Admiral Byrd's statements were that he made to this Chilean newspaper, which has been widely reprinted, and I have a copy of the reprint of this article in the companion blog to this show. But let's take our break here, and then we'll discuss in Admiral Byrd's own words what he was afraid of when this supposed battle of February 1947 happened over the skies of Antarctica. And these are the comments that he made, which I have quoted in the companion blog to this show. Admiral Richard E. Byrd warned today that the United States should adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. The Admiral explained that he was not trying to scare anyone, but the cruel reality is that in case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. The fantastic speed with which the world is shrinking, recalled the Admiral, is one of the most important lessons learned during his recent Antarctic exploration. I have to warn my compatriots that the time has ended when we were able to take refuge in our isolation and rely on the certainty that the distances, the oceans, and the poles were a guarantee of safety. And that's the end of that quote. Now let those words sink in, because it's just almost too incredible to believe. What he says is that he learned that there are planes that were able to attack even the United States, and that he learned this while he was in Antarctica. Now, he doesn't mention the Germans or he doesn't mention the Nazis, but we have to ask ourselves, well, if not them, then who was he talking about? And even a few months later, Admiral Byrd was later interviewed on American television, and there's a copy of this episode also linked in the blog. And this was an interview given on a show called Chronoscope that was sponsored by Longines, the jewelry company. And you can tell in his interview that he was probably directed by Secretary of Defense James Forrestal to sanitize his words and soften the tone of what he just said, because you certainly didn't want to get a whole nation of Americans in an uproar over the idea that perhaps the Nazi Party was not quite as defeated as we had been told. Now, I want to go back to some of the points that were made in that Russian documentary film, because that Lieutenant Sayerson referred to the destruction of a ship named the USS Maddox, or it might possibly be named Murdoch. Sometimes with Russian films, they don't transliterate the English words or names the way we would. Now, in the official Navy record, there is no mention of this ship, either Maddox or Murdoch. In fact, there are quite a few ships that have supposedly disappeared or whose records have been erased. Now, Steve Quayle, who has himself become a published author of Antarctica Mysteries, makes this comment on his Operation High Jump webpage, which I have linked in my blog, that focuses on another missing ship record. And I mention this so that you know that it's not a surprise if you encounter names of naval ships that have been completely erased from the U.S. Navy's record. Here's what Steve Quayle wrote. But here's where the story gets interesting. The USS Pine Island was struck from the Naval Register on an unknown date. Her title was transferred to the Maritime Administration for layup in the National Defense Reserve Fleet on an unknown date. And the ship's final disposition is also unknown. Now, he says, how does one go about losing a major surface ship over 640 feet long, almost 70 feet wide, with a displacement of over 15,000 tons? The story, of course, gets stranger still. The Pine Island is not the only ship involved in Antarctic research or exploration to have disappeared. There were numerous others. The question is not so much how many. That is fairly well established. The question is how and why, particularly why. And that's the end of the quote from Steve Quayle's webpage. Now, if the U.S. Navy really did engage with Nazi craft on February 26, 1947, you can understand why the Navy would then have turned to their friends in Hollywood to drywall over the entire debacle. Taxpayers were going to ask why an operation that was supposed to last 6 months suddenly got cut short after 6 or 8 weeks. Voila! 18 months later, the film called The Secret Land, and linked in my blog, was sent out to soothe the public. Keep in mind that a few other notable events happened in between this battle and the launch of that Hollywood film, notably the Roswell UFO incident of July of 1947 and the establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency, which took place in September 1947, and the official establishment of the United States Air Force, which also took place in September 1947. And from that point forward, the Cold War was also evolving into a reality. Now, I'm going to mention the link to the official Hollywood film that the U.S. Navy produced, the one called The Secret Land. And there's something really bizarre that is depicted near the beginning of this movie. One of the eyebrow-raising traditions in many nations' navies is the bizarre ritual that takes place on board a ship when the crew crosses the line. That is, when it crosses the equator during a voyage. And those of you who may have traveled on a passenger cruise ship, I have heard that some cruise lines also commemorate the crossing of the equator with some sort of party or some sort of silly ritual. Now, this tradition of crossing the line is something I believe I first heard about in a British TV film called Chasing Shackleton, or it might have possibly been the film called Longitude. Both productions are worthy of your time if you're getting hopelessly obsessed with this polar topic, as I seem to be. And you can probably find those movies on either Netflix or Amazon Video or Google Video. And I'll mention the titles again. Chasing Shackleton, or another movie is simply called Longitude. Now, in that Hollywood film, Secret Land, near the beginning of the documentary, there is actual video footage of the ritual that the sailors participated in as the American ships in Operation High Jump were headed towards the South Pole, towards Antarctica. I have a Wikipedia page that relates the history of this tradition. It should not surprise us that there would be a mythical tradition that has been handed down From Phoenicians to Babylonians to Greeks to Europeans, as yet another memory of a prehistorical antediluvian civilization. And here's the quote from the Wikipedia page. After crossing the line, or that is crossing the equator, the polywogs received subpoenas to appear before King Neptune at his court, usually including his first assistant, Davy Jones, and Her Highness Tridy, and often various dignitaries, who were all represented by the highest-ranking seamen, who officiate at the ceremony, which is often preceded by a beauty contest of men dressing up as women, each department of the ship being required to introduce one contestant in swimsuit drag. Afterwards, some wogs may be interrogated by King Neptune and his entourage, and the use of a truth serum, sometimes something gross like hot sauce and aftershave, and whole uncooked eggs put in the mouth. During the ceremony, the polywogs undergo a number of increasingly embarrassing ordeals, like wearing your clothing inside out and backwards, crawling on hands and knees on non-skid coated decks, being swatted with short lengths of fire hose, being locked in stocks and pillories and pelted with mushy fruit, being locked in a water coffin of salt water and bright green sea dye or fluorescent sodium salt, crawling through chutes or large tubs of rotting garbage, kissing the royal baby's belly coated with axle grease, hair chopping, and other things. All of this being done largely for the entertainment of the other group on board called the shellbacks. Now, believe it or not, like I mentioned, this sort of tradition, almost like a hazing incident, is actually depicted in the film Secret Land because it was actually recorded with a camera on these U.S. naval ships as they crossed the equator heading for Antarctica as they embarked this operation called Operation High Jump. Now, to conclude this story, I'm going to introduce what will become the next episode of this Antarctica saga, and this has to do with James Forrestal. He became America's first Secretary of Defense, and the reason why we call him the first Secretary of Defense is because before that, that title had been named the Secretary of War. So during World War II, the official we would now call Secretary of Defense was actually called the Secretary of War. Well, as if all of the above governmental cover-ups, conspiracies, obfuscations, and red herrings are not enough, another tragedy occurred less than a year after this movie, The Secret Land, was shown in theaters. This is the bizarre and still unexplained death of James V. Forrestal, the decorated war hero who served Operation High Jump as Secretary of the Navy. In fact, both Secretary Forrestal and Rear Admiral Byrd did not live long after these events. Actually, Byrd went on to live a few years, but even the timing of his death has been a topic for suspicion and conspiracy. In the next installment of this saga about Antarctica mysteries, we'll take a look at what happened to Secretary Forrestal, a carefully planted diary of Admiral Byrd by a Bank of America operative, and the perpetuation of the original esoteric idea that a Shangri-La does in fact exist down in Antarctica. Various events in the 20th century that shaped exploration of the land surrounding the South Pole. In our previous episode, we discussed the massive military expedition that the U.S. Navy launched way too late in the year of 1946 to do any good before the paralyzing winter of Antarctica set in. And we discussed the alarming interview that Admiral Byrd gave to a newspaper in Chile just days after that operation was abruptly canceled in February of 1947. Now, in today's episode, we will review a timeline of noteworthy events in this whole history and end with the tragic and still disputed account of what happened to Admiral Byrd's boss, James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense who was appointed by President Truman, but who died by apparent suicide in 1949. Now, what happened following the failure of Operation High Jump in 1947 is that men in high places made sure that the truth about all post-World War II Nazi evolution was tightly controlled. From the beginning of both the North and South Pole exploration expeditions, the banksters like John D. Rockefeller and their agents made sure that the narrative of what was going on at the poles would proceed under their direction. Now, to jump into the story today, I wanted to just step back and review some of the key points, events that happened in a continual chronological timeline, starting with the year 1871. Now, as this jigsaw puzzle continues to come into view, it is important to see how some events that you might never have considered to be related to our southern continent just might, after all, be entirely connected. And in 1871, that's the year that I pinpointed to start off my whole series of events that have happened recently in Antarctica. And by recently, we mean within the last 150 years. It was in 1871 when a man in Great Britain named Lord Edward Bulwer-Lytton published his fictional tale called The Vril, The Coming Race. This was a story set in a mythical world accessed by underground tunnel systems. In his story, the society in this underground world was a technologically supported utopia, and the chief energy force in their society was said to be an all-permeating fluid called the Vril, and that's spelled V like Victor, R-I-L. It was supposedly a latent source of energy that only the spiritually elevated hosts were able to master through the training of their will to a degree that depended on their hereditary constitution. Now, that was supposed to be a fictional tale. However, there's some things about Lord Edward that people need to know about him. For one thing, he was regarded by many as the great patron of the British Rosicrucian order, even though he publicly disavowed that title on a clever technicality. But to this day, it has been generally accepted that he was either a prominent member of the Rosicrucian order or, in fact, in charge of it at the time of his writing of these books. Now, after he published that fictional story, the narrative got picked up by people who belonged and were sort of running other secret societies, notably Madame Blavatsky, who was the head of the Theosophy movement of the late 19th century. So around the year 1888, she and other occultists like Annie Besant began spreading the notion that this fictional story of the Vril was really based on ancient wisdom truth. And if you know anything about Madame Blavatsky and the other occultists of her era, they spent a lot of time around Central Asia, especially in Tibet, exploring ancient sacred legends, and there was this belief that there was some secret society or secret civilization located in the polar regions, and that this area was called Agartha or Shambhala, and that if you could arrive at these areas through the knowledge and wisdom that would be passed on to you by the shamans of the Central Asia, of Tibet and the Himalaya mountains. Now, this came to the attention of the Germans, who began setting up expeditions both to Antarctica and to Tibet. So I'm going to run down in this timeline some of those key dates when the Germans were running around the world trying to discover the truth about these ancient legends. So in 1901 to 1903, the Germans set up their first Antarctic expedition, and then a few years later, 1911 to 1913, they sent their second Antarctic expedition, and note that this was just before World War I. Now, after World War I, in 1918, the Thule Society gets established. Rudolf Hess is a prominent member of this society, and you've heard that name if you've ever watched any Nazi documentaries on the History Channel or any movies about the Nuremberg trials. Rudolf Hess is a prominent figure. Now, he maintains close association with Madame Blavatsky and her Theosophy movement. Now, jump forward to the years 1924 to 1928. Here's a man whose name you may not ever have heard of. His name was Nicholas Roerich. He was a Russian mystic who was also heavily interested in the ancient legends of Tibet. But what you don't know is that he is the man who would inspire the occult symbols that are now sitting on the back of the American $1 bill. That was something that got designed into the American money in the year 1935, a few years following the Great Wall Street crash and the Depression of 1929. But Nicholas Roerich was also leading a search for this mystical land of Shambhala in Tibet. Now, in 1926, here comes our first public Rockefeller connection. It was the Rockefeller family that financed Richard Byrd's first flight over the North Pole in 1926. And then here comes 1928, when Richard Byrd begins his first expedition to the South Pole, to Antarctica. And his ship, coincidentally enough, has a connection to the Titanic tragedy. If I remember correctly, one of the ships that served as a rescue ship in the Titanic tragedy later got repurposed and rechristened and became part of Richard Byrd's fleet of ships that went down in this 1928 expedition to Antarctica, which is just a curious little odd coincidence. Now, jump forward to 1929. That's when that Peary Reese map of prehistoric Antarctica that I mentioned in the second episode of this series, that's when that map got suddenly rediscovered by a German theologian. In 1930, Heinrich Himmler and Rudolf Hess sent a German expedition to Tibet in 1930. Then in 1933, we have the author James Hilton writes the book Lost Horizon, which, as many of you may remember, this story being made into a movie in the late 70s. Lost Horizon depicted a mythical paradise of immortality in an ice world. In 1934, a notable intellectual writer named Julius Evola published a book entitled Revolt Against the Modern World, Politics, Religion, and Social Order in the Kali Yuga, which became sort of a Bible to the post-war Vienna group. Now notice that happened in 1934, and he became quite an influential, I want to say something like a mystic, more like an intellectual mystic, but a lot of people in the Nazi Party adopted his views, and they became motivation for beliefs that would be kicked off even after World War II. But that we'll have more about that in the episode that comes after this one. Now back to the timeline. In 1934, Himmler and Hess send another German expedition to Tibet. In 1935, Himmler established that elite Nazi Astounding project to search for multiple sources of ancient wisdom that can be used to build new technology. And those of us who remember the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark saw a portrayal of the Nazi Astounding project. Those were those evil Nazi men who were scouring Tibet for the secret clues and codes that they needed to find the treasures of the Lost Ark. Well, that was sort of a real group. The Nazis really did have a secretive cult within the SS that was looking for, they were gathering just hundreds or even thousands of ancient sacred books and documents to try to get to this ancient sacred energy source. Now, jump forward a little bit to, again, in the year 1935, as I had mentioned previously, this is when President Roosevelt ordered the occult redesign of the American $1 bill under the influence of the man who was then Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace. But Wallace, in his turn, was under the guidance of Nicholas Roerich, who was sort of a student of this Russian mystic named Nicholas Roerich. And as we all know, the design on the back of the $1 bill includes an eye over a pyramid. And most people assume that's referring to the Egyptian pyramids, but when you consider what's being possibly discovered or possibly sitting in Antarctica, it may in fact refer to some other kind of a pyramid, not the one in Egypt. Now, in 1936, we have the popular horror author H.P. Lovecraft serialized a fictional Antarctic horror story named At the Mountains of Madness. 1938, American polar explorer Richard Byrd lectured the Germans on his recent intelligence gathered about Antarctica, and this was a speech and a visit he made to the German people, which was sponsored by Rudolf Hess's Thule Society. And that was 1938, so that was before World War II had started, really just months before. In 1938, Himmler and Hess sent a third German expedition to Tibet. Then near the end of the year, in 38 and 39, Germany launched a third expedition to Antarctica, and that's when they began dropping little Nazi flags all over Norway's claim on the northern coast. And many people view this incursion by the Germans on another nation's territory as the first step in world domination that Germany took even before annexing Czechoslovakia. Of course, after 1939, World War II gets started, and the war dominates the entire timeline for the next 5 years. But in 1944, an important meeting takes place in Strasbourg, France. This is when certain elite officers of the Nazi Party see that the war is beginning to turn against them, but they held a meeting on August 10th of 1944 in Strasbourg, France, at a hotel called the Maison Rouge, which means the Red Hotel. So this has become known as the Red Hotel meeting, or the Red Hotel Papers. And we know that it was at this time that the elite officers of the Nazi Party set up their corporate escape plans. They had a meeting with several bankers and industrialists to make plans to sort of money launder the Nazis' great wealth into all kinds of corporations all across the world, which then became the basis of every big corporate structure you can think of, the big pharmaceuticals, the military-industrial complex, or maybe international banking cartel. All of this got set in stone at this meeting in 1944. All right, then comes along 1945, the end of the war. But what also happened are that the Nazi elites escaped from Berlin down to the southern hemisphere. The propaganda of Hitler's suicide begins spread and is handed to the Allies by the Secretary of the Navy, Karl Dönitz, who gets appointed as Chancellor of Germany just days before the end of the war. He made deals, we suppose, with the Allies to allow Nazi research and their financial empire to continue functioning. And we believe that that was really part of the whole deal that was made to bring an end to World War II. As long as the Allies allowed certain high-placed Nazi officers to continue their work, that they would agree to let the war come to an end. But also 1945 saw the British rescue operation known as Operation Tabarin in Antarctica. We had a previous show about that. And claims were made of a fully functional and militarized Nazi cavern base, and even the possibility of genetically engineered polar man, or something like a Bigfoot, was supposedly observed down at that base. Then comes 1946 and 1947. The disastrous Operation High Jump, which was the subject of our previous episode. Admiral Byrd then warns of enemy craft that can fly from pole to pole. Now, and this is an important point that is overlooked by so many people. Admiral Byrd did give an interview to a newspaper in Chile when he indicated that there was aircraft that were capable of flying quickly from the North Pole to the South Pole and vice versa. Now, that interview was given in February of 1947, but then what happened in July of 1947, that's when we saw the supposed UFO crash at Roswell, New Mexico. And it's interesting, here we are, this show is being recorded in the month of June 2017. In just a few more weeks, we will be coming up to the 70-year anniversary of that event. So it's been 70 years since Admiral Byrd warned the world that there was craft already capable of flying at fantastic speeds over long distances. Now, other things happened in 1947, which this year is, again, the 70-year anniversary of those agencies. That's when the CIA, the Department of Air Force, the Department of Defense, all of these agencies got established officially by the U.S. government. And it's this year that marks the rise of what is now being called the deep state or the national security state. A year after this, in 1948, Austrian Nazi scientist Ronald Richter gets Argentina's President Juan Perón to fund a nuclear research facility in Bariloche. He claimed limited success in the development of fusion power. 1949, America's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, gets suicided on May 22nd, 1949. He is the officer who had oversight of Operation High Jump when he was still Secretary of the Navy. Now, 1950, the Vienna Group continues to promote the Nazi Vril mythology. This club will later be succeeded by a group called the Causa Nostra. And this is going to become an important point in the next episode, that this idea of the Nazi Vril energy source did not die away with World War II. But instead of dying down, these people actually doubled down and increased the spread of their propaganda that this would be found and that there was a future coming race of people or human hybrids, or what we would call today transhumanism, the transhumanist movement that was going to make this these great technological advances possible. In 1957, Admiral Richard Byrd did die on March 11th. Supposedly he died in his sleep at his home in Boston. You don't hear a lot about that, but some people have always suspected whether he did die of natural causes. In 1959, now just 2 years later, an obscure author named F. Amadeo Giannini published the book entitled Worlds Beyond the Poles, Physical Continuity of the Universe. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him a little later in this story. That book set off a firestorm of controversy by making an unproven claim that Admiral Byrd had made trips to both Antarctica and the Arctic poles in 1947. Also in that year, 1959, the International Antarctic Treaty was signed. You can find a pretty interesting Wikipedia page about that. But here's a little summary of what that treaty is all about. And I quote from Wikipedia here: the treaty, entering into force in 1961 and having 53 parties as of last year, sets aside Antarctica as a scientific preserve, establishes freedom of scientific investigation, and bans military activity on that continent. The treaty was the first arms control agreement established during the Cold War. The Antarctic Treaty Secretariat headquarters have been located, guess where? In Buenos Aires, Argentina, ever since September of 2004. Now that's kind of interesting. The continent of Antarctica is sort of like a neutral zone. I think of it as almost like the Switzerland of the Southern Hemisphere. Supposedly there can be no war launched there, and all nations supposedly have equal access to it. Now you can already imagine in your mind how a treaty like that would well enable covert research to be done, because nobody's really policing it. So then in 1961, the treaty that was signed in 1959 goes into effect. And then just 4 years later, in 1965, there's a huge UFO flap, or a lot of stories and accounts are getting reported about UFOs being sighted over Antarctica, Australia, and Argentina from June through September. And remember, those three countries are all located close to each other. When you're down in the lower latitudes of planet Earth, Antarctica, Australia, and Argentina are all very close neighbors of each other. So that's our timeline that covers the years from 1871 to 1965. So almost 100 years of deep interest in the Antarctica that has all been spurred on by well-placed books and propaganda who are advancing these ancient legends of secret energy forces and a race of people who have hereditary claim to all of this. Keep all of that in the back of your mind. Now, we mentioned that the Rockefeller family had great interest, and they were actually the people who were funding Admiral Byrd's or Richard Byrd's explorations. He wasn't an admiral at the time he made his first exploration. But you should always keep that in mind in almost anything that ever happens. How many times have we stated the line, follow the money? Well, in this section of the story, we'll discuss how banksters from east to west are diverting the public's attention. It's well known that Richard Byrd conducted many expeditions to both the North and South Poles, but what is not often mentioned is the name of his financial backer, which was John D. Rockefeller. And since this segment is coming to an end, we'll pick that up by talking about how it was that the Rockefeller was interested in Antarctica. Well, getting back to John D. Rockefeller, we have a researcher named Dennis Crenshaw who posted these comments that I have a link to his article on my blog, but I'll just read what his comments were. He said, in 1926, following orders from his mentor and lifetime financial backer, John D. Rockefeller, Byrd made his first and only exploration flight in the northern area and found enough proof of what he was looking for 80 miles from the North Pole to be able to turn back. He never made it to the non-existent North Geological Pole because he had no need to. What he needed to know, information regarding the measurement of the curvature of the planet, he found long before the non-existent point called the North Geographical Pole was reached. Because flying to the pole was the media spin for his activity, documents, which have since been proven wrong, were doctored in a disinformation campaign to report that Byrd flew to the North Pole. Now here's the point of what Richard Byrd's purpose was in flying to the North Pole in 1926. He reported in and had a debriefing session with Rockefeller and other members of the controller cartel. They decided to concentrate their efforts in the quest for the mysteries of the poles at the southern end of our globe for a couple of reasons. The northern area of our planet is the most populated, so therefore harder to hide movement and exploration up there. And down at the South Pole, there is a large landmass totally empty of permanent human occupation on which to build a permanent home base for operations. So this is why they decided to concentrate their activities at the South Pole. And they sent Admiral Byrd, or I keep calling him Admiral, but at this time he was a civilian. Richard Byrd was sent down there, and he set up a series of base camps, which even today are all called Little America, and that's where you'll find the McMurdo Station, which has become quite a bustling little town of its own during the summer months of Antarctica. And that's basically the place where people arrive when they come to visit Antarctica. They start with the America's headquarters down there at McMurdo Station. Now, as we discussed in our timeline above, there was international interest in Antarctica that gradually transitioned from being privately funded expeditions toward government-funded operations. And once the CIA was created in 1947, the banksters continued running the show down in Antarctica, but now they could do it by steering their operations from behind the curtain of this newly created deep state megastructure in the government. And wouldn't you know it, but Rockefeller himself got an Antarctic mountain plateau named after himself, a plateau whose elevation is curiously marked by the figures 666 meters on the map. And in the blog that accompanies this episode, I have a picture of that map. It wasn't just Rockefeller who was interested in the mysteries of the poles at the southern end. 2 years after the death of Admiral Byrd, a self-styled scientist by the name of Francis Amadeo Giannini published a book entitled Worlds Beyond the Poles that set off a firestorm of controversy about Byrd's whereabouts in the year 1947. Now, if that name Amadeo Giannini sounds familiar, and it should to anyone who's lived in California for many decades, it's because this man, Francis Amadeo Giannini, was a member of the A.P. Giannini family, and he is the founder of San Francisco's Bank of Italy, which we all know today by the name Bank of America. This author, Giannini, made the claim that Byrd had made a secret Arctic North Pole trip in February of 1947, even though publicly we were all told he had made his trip at Operation High Jump down to the South Pole. So this man was claiming that Admiral Byrd had gone both to Antarctica and the Arctic Pole in the same year. Now, apparently, he twisted statements that Byrd had made about Antarctica and claimed that those statements applied to what Byrd witnessed at the North Pole. Much debate followed, along with the sudden surfacing of a supposed long-lost secret diary of Admiral Byrd's. Crenshaw, quoted above, or earlier, has posted extensive debunking of the claims of this author. This is another example of how the banksters were becoming quite adept at using well-placed propaganda to divert the public's attention away from what they should have been looking at creating false narratives and rewriting history and causing us all to doubt that we know what we know. He wrote this: the first mention of a 1947 North Polar flight by the Admiral can be found in the book Worlds Beyond the Poles, Physical Continuity of the Universe, published in 1959 by controversial self-proclaimed scientist F. Amadeo Giannini. On page 13 of his book, he presents a list of things that happened during those years to support his theory. And this is what one of his supposed diary entries was. Now, keep in mind, this author is trying to make us believe that this statement is being made about the North Pole, but really it's being made about the South Pole. And supposedly, Admiral Byrd wrote this: in 1947, February, I'd like to see that land beyond the pole. The area beyond the pole is the center of the great unknown. Now, this researcher, Mr. Crenshaw, says not only was this the first time a 1947 flight was ever mentioned, but this also seems to be the origin of this often used quote attributed to Admiral Byrd and used by Hollow Earth people to constantly prove their point. The actual source of this quote was probably an article that appeared in the October 1947 issue of National Geography magazine entitled Our Navy Explores Antarctica, in which the Admiral refers several times to the mystery land beyond the pole, although not in the sequence of words presented by Mr. Giannini. And most importantly of all, Byrd was talking about Antarctica. And then this author, Mr. Crenshaw, reminds us of the family connections of this author. His family owned the Bank of Italy and the Bank of America. If, as my research seems to indicate, the one-worlders, what we would call the New World Order people, if it's their plan to hide what is going on at the Earth's poles, what better way to cloud the water, so to speak, than to have one of their own, an admitted member of an international banking family, toss in a controversy such as this phony trip by Byrd to make the Hollow Earth people look ridiculous, and it seems to have worked. The 1947 Byrd secret flight has kept anyone from looking into what was really going on in 1947. And that's the end of that quote. So by causing these false narratives to be spread out amongst the general public, the people could be cajoled into believing that the whispers about Nazi bases in Antarctica were all false and should just be ignored. Besides, we all have other things to worry about, like the Cold War and the now regular pattern of international conflict and financial boom and bust cycles. So people like this author, Mr. Giannini, who were working as agents of the international banking cartel that included Rockefeller and Rothschild, they did a good job of diverting the public's attention away from what was really going on at the South Pole. Now, when all of this is happening, then we also have the sad story of the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, who by the time of his death was Secretary of Defense, the very first Secretary of Defense of this nation. And there still seems to be a question of what really happened to him. The short story is that he cracked under pressure, he went insane, he had to be admitted into Bethesda Naval Hospital for treatment, and then one night he got up and fashioned a hanging noose from his dressing gown, tied one end of it to the radiator in his hospital kitchen located on the 16th floor, and then proceeded to jump out the window to his death. Supposedly, the noose that he had made for himself broke, and then, of course, he fell to his death. There are several holes in that narrative. One that should immediately jump out to you is this: why would you hang yourself and leap to your death as if the fall alone from the 16th floor wasn't sufficient to do the job? That's one thing that has puzzled researchers. Why would he have created a hangman's noose? You know, you wouldn't need that. You would just jump out the window. And then there are the dozen or so inconsistencies in the evidence, like how somebody forgot to mention the bits of broken glass on his pillowcase and the scratch marks on the exterior ledge, as if he was struggling to get back inside his room. We do know that there is plenty of backstory to this tragedy for somebody to take a second look at the role that Forrestal's rivals from the Defense Department played. Whatever the truth is, there are dozens of books and websites about the theories. Richard M. Dolan wrote about the Forrestal death in his book, UFOs and the National Security State, a book that has come to be the Bible on the history of the development of the breakaway civilization. Nevertheless, Dolan feels that the only logical explanation for the murder of Forrestal was his involvement with the Roswell cover-up, his connection to Majestic 12, and the general submersion of the truth about extraterrestrials by the government. Well, I would encourage Dolan and all others who care to meditate on the subject to consider the Antarctica timeline that has been presented in this account today. And then go back and reread Dolan's words on page 115 of his book. On March 28, 1949, President Truman abruptly replaced Forrestal with a new Secretary of Defense. And for public consumption, Truman participated in a ceremony that was meant to honor James Forrestal for his years of service. Well, that event would prove to be Forrestal's final public appearance, because as Forrestal was leaving that ceremony, the newly created Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, made his way to Forrestal's side and indicated that there was something Forrestal needed to know. The two men had become professional antagonists of each other, so it remains a mystery as to why Secretary Symington felt compelled at this moment to further destroy Forrestal's mental health when Forrestal was no longer a professional threat. Dolan relates what happened next. What followed after the ceremony remains bizarre and mysterious. There is something I would like to talk to you about, Air Force Secretary Symington told Forrestal, and accompanied him privately during the ride back to the Pentagon. What Symington said is not known, but Forrestal emerged from the ride completely, deeply upset, even traumatized upon arrival at his office. Friends of Forrestal implied that Symington said something that shattered Forrestal's last remaining defenses. When someone entered Forrestal's office several hours later, the former Secretary of Defense did not notice. Instead, he sat rigidly at his desk, staring at the bare wall, incoherent, repeating a sentence, "You are a loyal fellow, you are a loyal fellow," a sentence he repeated for several hours. Next, Forrestal was taken to Florida by the Air Force, where he spoke the words noted at the top of my written blog, which was, "Bob, they're after me." He said these words to his friend, Bob Lovett. After being interviewed by Pentagon doctors and psychologists, Forrestal was checked into a room on the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital. Over the next few weeks, his mental state actually appeared to improve. But then one night, while transcribing a verse from an old poem written by Sophocles called Ajax, in fact, while trailing off in the middle of an unfinished word in that poem, Forrestal apparently committed suicide or was suicided. And I have a copy of the full poem there in the blog. The book goes on to say, Forrestal's alleged last written statement, touted in the contemporary press and later biographers as an implied suicide note, was part of a poem from W.M. Fred's translation of the Sophocles tragedy Ajax. But this is how Wikipedia reports this strange macabre trophy of this supposed suicide note. Now, I will submit here that if you read this poem, there's plenty of connection a person can make to the continent of Antarctica if you just think about it. I'll read it in closing of this radio show. I also have an interview in my blog with a man named Tim Swartz who summarizes many of the developments that focused on Antarctica during the post-war period. And in the next show in this Antarctica series, we'll take a look seismographs that Dr. Joseph Farrell included at the end of his book entitled Roswell and the Right that point to the possibility that scalar technology, or something even worse, scalar weaponry, has been tested in Antarctica. And we'll also talk about this mysterious group called the Vienna Group, who morphed into a very active German-speaking society to this day that has adopted a very un-German name of the Causa Nostra, but who are still promoting the idea that there is a special race of ethnically qualified people who have a right to this secret free energy source that is supposedly obtainable at the South Pole or in Tibet. There's a connection between the two of them. Now, the occult esoteric basis for seeking control of our southern continent has not died down in the least. And in closing, I'll just read this short poem, this poem Ajax, which is what Secretary of Defense James Forrestal was actually writing down, and he abruptly stopped in the middle of a certain word in this poem, and that was the last thing he ever wrote. And I will admit I do not know which word in this poem is the one that he stopped. I'm still trying to figure out that point. But the poem is about the island of Salamis, which, if you know anything from history, there was a battle fought between the Persians and the Greeks, and the Persians outnumbered the Greeks, but it was the Greeks who won the battle, which all of that in itself is a lot of possible code for whatever is going on in Antarctica, especially if you think of Antarctica as a very huge island. It's a continent, but on the map it does look like an island, and a lot of people think Antarctica may even be the ancient island of Atlantis. But here's the poem. Fair Salamis, the billows roar, wander around thee yet, and sailors gaze upon thy shore, firm in the ocean set. Thy sun is in a foreign clime, where Ida feeds her countless flocks. Far from thy dear remembered rocks, worn by the waste of time, comfortless, nameless, hopeless save, in the dark prospect of the yawning grave. Woe to the mother in her close of day, woe to her desolate heart and temples gray, when she shall hear her loved one's story whispered in her ear. Woe, woe will be the cry, no quiet murmur like the tremulous wail of the lone bird, the querulous nightingale. And that's the poem Ajax by Sophocles.